We'll try to create this stylized chewing mouth animation. Before creating a promo, we had this nice sketch. It looks very simple, but sometimes simple stuff is very hard to create using standard Cinema 4D tools. That's why I'm gonna show you some simple but effective non-standard solutions for different problems. We're gonna use some of the techniques we already used in previous lesson, such as Espresso, Volume Builder. We'll find out how to deform the object using spline and how to snap objects to a surface, like these scales. For this scene, I already have a 3D model. It is very simple. That's why I'll quickly run through all the objects and tell about some modeling tools I used. You can see the structure in Object Manager. Let's take the first null called lips. It contains only one object. The best way to create this kind of object is to use spline. I just used rectangle spline, in my case 400 by 300 centimeters. I also used sweep to give it some thickness and used circle as a cross-section. To make it smoother, in rectangle attributes you can find a rounding parameter. You can adjust its radius. The mesh is not very good, it's very dense and uneven. To fix this, select splines, switch intermediate points to uniform and adjust the number of polygons. And do the same for the other. Switch to uniform, in my case 8 looks nice. After that, I made it editable, and because it will be symmetrical, we can select all polygons except one corner and remove it. Now you can modify it using modeling tools and then mirror it horizontally and vertically. If you want to know how I made these folds, it is very easy. Just select an edge loop, then right-click on a viewport and select Bevel tool. I set subdivision to 1 to get this edge loop in the middle. You can scale it down and dip it into the surface. Also, you can use sculpting tools to create more organic shape. Here you can see some pentagons, but if you use subdivision surface, you can see it smooths out pretty well. But just in case, try to keep everything in quads. The next null is top. It contains only two objects, teeth and gums. And the null itself has a shape of a cube. We need this to be able to select it in a viewport. We're gonna animate the movement of the upper and lower jaw, and it will be very convenient. Gums are very easy to create. I just created a cylinder, removed the top part. To create this rounding, just select an edge loop, duplicate it, rotate 45 degrees, then duplicate it again, and rotate 45 degrees. And to connect the topology, select these edges, extrude it, and we got a place for one polygon here. Use Polygon Pen to create it. Hold down Shift, click and drag this edge like this. And do the same for the other side. You can also select the border edge and extrude it like this. And then, using this topology, you can add or remove edge loops and use modeling or sculpting tools to adjust its shape. Teeth are also pretty simple. I just used cube. I created 4 segments on a front plane and 3 on a side. Then made it editable and delete these top polygons. Then I created 2 support loops on the sides using loop path cut. And another 2 edge loops to separate these 2 edges, which I can turn to dimples using bevel. A little sculpting won't be excessive, it will add a little life. The next null, called bot, which means bottom, it looks completely the same. The only difference is that I sculpted a bit to make it look different. The null called inside contains 2 objects, which are a mouth cavity and this little uvula. The mouth cavity was made out of a cube. Just remove front polygon and extrude it several times like this. And basically it's done, just use subdivision surface. And uvula is also very easy. Just create a cube, select all polygons, use subdivision surface, and set one iteration. Then remove these 4 top polygons, select the border edge and adjust it, and then extrude it several times. The next object is the skin around the lips. To make it fit tightly to the lips, I used the geometry of the lips itself. When the model of the lips is done, you can select one of the edge loops on the inside of the lips. This is the front side and this is the inside. And when it's selected, use Edge to Spline. It will create the spline object based on selected edges. It should appear as a child. Just drag it out. In my case, it looks like this. I'm gonna make a big n-gon out of it. To do so, I used Extrude. I need only front polygon. That's why I reduced the offset to 0 and make it editable. I want to extrude it outwards. That's why I'll select all edges and use Extrude. But now it extrudes along normals, so we need to adjust the angle of rotation. I'll set it to 90. And to increase the amount of polygons, we'll just increase the subdivision. Delete the central polygon and it's done. I also want to slightly extrude the inner border and deepen it inside the mouth. And the last object is a little scale. We're going to spread it over the surface of the skin later. To create a scale, I just created one polygon, then used smooth subdivision with one iteration, gave it the right shape, then selected border edges like this and extruded down a little, and then slightly inwards. And to create the support loop around the edge, I used line cut. It allows us to create edges on the surface of the polygons. I also want to add 2 support loops around the middle edge. Support loops helps to create sharp edges using subdivision surface, and it will also create sharp tip. When the models are ready, we can start to create a rig. I want to animate the movement of the jaws. We will animate these 2 nulls, and I want to make the skin and the lips to move along. The animation itself is very simple. It will be just moved up and down and will take around 14 frames. And I want to make the rig as simple as possible. Let's start with the lips. And the simplest way I found is to use rectangle spline, adjust its shape to match the shape of the lips. Then hit C to make it editable. I want to use this spline to deform the shape of the lips. It will be very similar to FFD deformer. To do so, select the lips geometry, hold down Alt, and create Spline Deformer. It should be the child of the lips geometry. To make it work, we need 2 splines, original and modifying. So let's duplicate the spline and rename it properly. Now let's drag it into Spline Deformer. The spline modifier will change the positions of the points based on the difference between 2 splines. So the original spline should stay as it is, and we're gonna animate the spline called mod. Now it looks not very good, but before we fix it, let's create a controllers for these points. I like the way we made it in Marshmallow lesson using Espresso, but I want to show you another way. Select the spline called mod and create ikSpline tag. It's not usually used in this way, but sometimes it works fine. In spline field, we need to select the spline we want to modify, and the field called end must contain any object except the spline we want to modify, because the tag will not work without it. To create the controllers, let's go to Handles tab. We have 4 points, so we need 4 controllers. Just click this button 4 times. Here you can select objects to control each point, or you can create nulls. Just click 4 times. It will create 4 nulls located in the points positions. Let's make them visible. Also zero out the rotations. Now original and modifying splines looks the same, and I want to somehow store the positions of the nulls to be able to get back the original state without remembering all the coordinates. To do so, we can just freeze all coordinates. You can see here we have some local coordinates, and if you click freeze all, it will be stored here, and local coordinates will become 0. It means that if I move it and then reset the coordinates, it will jump back into frozen position. Next, I'm going to move it around and see how it deforms the shape of the lips. For now, it looks terrible. Let's try to select the spline modifier and adjust the radius. Looks much better, but we have some issues in the corners. To fix it, we're going to use Delta Mesh. Make sure it's a child of the lips and place it after the spline modifier. This modifier will try to restore the original shape. You can play with iterations and tangent mode. In our case, it looks good enough because the mouth will never close completely and will not take any complicated poses. Next, I'm going to rename these controllers respectively. And next, I'm going to place lower controllers inside null called bot and upper controllers to top. When we change the hierarchy of the objects, the local coordinates can change. So we need to freeze it again relative to parent objects. And just to be sure, I'll move it a bit, zero out the coordinates, and it jumps back. Let's see how it looks with the teeth. And I also recommend to freeze the coordinates of the nulls top and bot. In my case, they are already frozen. And to deform the skin, we're going to use already deformed lips. For this, select Skin Geometry, hold down Shift, and create Surface Deformer. It should be a child of the Skin Geometry. Then, in Attributes in Object tab, select a surface. In our case, it is Lips Geometry. Make sure that the shape of the lips now is original, not deformed, and then hit Initialize. Let's check how it works. Looks nice already, but we can make it more realistic if the points which are closer to the lips will be affected more than the points far from the lips. To do so, we can use Vertex Map tag. Create it on a Skin Geometry, isolate the geometry for convenience, then select this internal edge loop, then double-click on the Vertex Map tag to activate the Paint tool. You can paint polygons using different methods. Select Absolute and hit Apply Selected. We can expand this selected area if you switch mode to Bleed and hit Apply All several times. And to smooth it out, switch the mode to Smooth and also apply several times. Now we can use this vertex map as a field for this modifier. Just go to Fields tab and drag and drop the tag here. And now the surface modifier will affect only the yellow area. If I turn off this field, you can see that the polygons are stretched too much. And if I turn it back, it looks much more organic. I also want to add a little detail. When the mouth is closed, I want to widen the corners of the mouth. For this, we're going to use Pose Morph tag. Select the points mode, then select the pose 0 and adjust its shape. And if we switch to animate mode, we can animate this slider. It also works with deformed mouth. Now let's prepare the project for animation. Let's clean up the scene. I'll move these two splines inside Ellipse Null. We're going to use Redshift for render, so let's go to Render Settings and switch Renderer to Redshift. Now we can create the Redshift camera. I'll switch to Camera View, just click this little square and adjust its position. In Object tab, I'll adjust the focal length. And to protect the coordinates of the camera, I'll use Protection tag. We're going to animate in 12 FPS, so go to Mode, Project, and set FPS to 12. The entire animation will take 14 frames. Let's animate top and bottom nulls. In 0th frame, the mouth will be closed, so I'll move it like this and set a keyframe. And do the same for the bot null. Also reduce timeline to 14 frames. The mouth will be opened in frame 7 or 8, so I'll set a keyframes. Now use shortcut Shift plus F3 to reveal all animation tracks. Switch to Curve mode and select both nulls. The animation will be cycled, so I'll just duplicate the 0th frame to 14. Just to remind, if you want to duplicate, hold down Ctrl or Command on Mac. I want it to be closed a few frames before it opens, so I'll duplicate the first frame again and place it around 3rd frame. By the way, if you want to move points horizontally, hold down Shift. Also want to remove the slowing down before the last frame to make the teeth stop immediately when they touch. So the motion should be linear or even a little accelerated. Now let's animate the lower jaw along x-axis. In 0th frame, I'll move it to the left, set a keyframe, and because it's loop, I'll duplicate it into 14th frame. It will stay on the left for a while, and approximately in frame 3 or 4 it will go to the right. So I'll set a keyframe and adjust the shape of the curve. I'll speed up the video. I'll just slightly adjust the shape of all curves to achieve the feeling that it is very hard to open the mouth because of the sticky marshmallow, and then it snaps shut. I got this result. Now let's animate the Pose Morph tag. It will be 100% in frame 0 when the mouth is shut, so set a keyframe, then duplicate it to 14th frame. It will be widened till the frame 3 or 4, so I'll set another keyframe here, and when the mouth is open, I'll set it to 0. I want to add another one effect. I have a few objects hidden in layers. These are just a bunch of bubbles between teeth. They parented to nulls top and bot. Actually, this is the same object, which is just duplicated and rotated. Each object has pose morph tag and only one pose. This slider just inflates the bubble. I want to animate those sliders. When the mouth is shut, bubbles will be inflated and vice versa. Let me quickly show you how to create this setup. For this, create a bunch of spheres and place it something like this. I'm going to use Volume Builder, so I'll increase the number of segments. Next, let's create Volume Builder and Volume Mesher and place everything inside. I'll move some spheres so that it's not very symmetrical to look different from different angles. This way we can duplicate it and use it several times. To clean up the topology, let's use Remesh. Just hold down Alt and create Remesh object. I use Polygon Count mode, and you can adjust the number of polygons. If you're happy with the shape and topology, you can make it editable. Now it is just a polygonal mesh. To create the inflation effect, we're gonna use the vertex map tag. Let's create it, then double-click on vertex map tag to activate Paint tool. This way you can paint the vertex map using brush. We need to paint all the areas that we want to inflate, like bubbles. If you wanna erase, just hold down Ctrl or Command on Mac. You can also smooth if you hold down Shift. We can also experiment with modes and try to apply to all points. We already used bleed, but it's not very suitable for me. We can also try smooth, and also intensity might be helpful. When the map is ready, create a plane effector and drop it inside the mesh. We want to use vertex map, so let's drop it into fields list. Then go to Deformer tab and set deformation mode to point. In this mode, plane effector will move points relative to polygon normals. It works, but it uses the wrong axis, so go to Parameter tab and zero out everything except Z-axis. Let's see how it looks. You can also set strength to negative values. It will look like deflated bubbles. If you want to make it smoother, you can use smoothing modifier. Parent it to the mesh and place it after plane effector and increase the number of iterations. You can also experiment with fields. For example, you can drop the vertex map into smoothing fields. I'll leave it like this. It is not very convenient to animate a lot of parameters. That's why let's duplicate the entire setup and just make two states. I'll hide the first one, and the second one will be inflated, and I probably turn off the smoothing. And the first one will be deflated. Now select one object with all its children, right-click and hit Connect Objects plus Delete. Now it's just a mesh. Then do the same with the other object. And now we have two different states, and we can blend them using Pose Morph tag. I'll just select the deflated state and create Pose Morph tag, set it to points, and this time remove pose 0, then drag and drop second state into poses list. To make it relative, hit No. This way it will be stored inside Pose Morph tag. Now we can animate this slider in Animate mode, and you can remove second object. This way you can create a bunch of different bubbles, just duplicate it around the scene, then scale and rotate it to make it look different. I already placed them in a scene. I have 2 bubbles inside a top null and 1 bubble in the bot. I want them to be inflated in the frame 0. That's why I'll select all posemorph tags and set a keyframe, and then do the same in frame 14. And somewhere in the middle they will be deflated, so I'll set another keyframe and adjust the shape of the curves a little. To make this bubblegum inside the mouth, we're going to use the same setup we used for the snots in Marshmallow tutorial. So let's remember what it looks like. We have 2 nulls, start and end, which controls the points of the spline, and we also have the middle null, which is always in the middle between end and start. Last time we animated the end null, but this time we're going to bind the start null to the upper jaw and the end to the lower jaw. And it will be more convenient if we make the snot null invisible, so I'll change the shape to none. And I also changed the shape of the start null to sphere. This way we can independently select them in viewport. The middle null is in the middle only along y-axis, but in this case we need to make it exactly in the middle between 2 nulls. So select the constraint tag and enable X and Z positions. But I want to get back the ability to adjust its position, so let's select the middle null, hold down Shift and create another null. Let's call it mid. Then move the constraint tag from the middle to mid. Now it controls the position of the parent null, but we can still move the middle inside the parent null. If you remember, the end null has a track modifier tag which simulates some secondary motion. This time we don't need it, but we can reuse it to simulate middle. Just drag it and drop onto middle. And to see how it works, I'll temporarily animate the end null. I'll just set 2 keyframes and it will move from side to side. By the way, I can show you how to loop the animation. Just select the animation track you want to loop, right-click, go to After, and hit Repeat After. It doesn't work for now. If you remember, we created the user data. We need to enable the simulation. It controls the enabling of the track modifier. But it still doesn't work because track modifier modifies existing tracks. So we need to create the animation track. Just select the middle and set keyframes in frame 0. Now it should work. But also we need to set the right priority. Track modifier should change the position after the constraint tag. The constraint tag has priority 1, so track modifier priority should be higher. I'll set it to 2. It works fine, so for now I'll disable the simulation and remove all animation. The mouth will be stretched a lot, and if you remember, if we stretch the snot, it becomes thinner. If the maximum distance is too low, it will disappear. Let's check our user data. You can see the maximum value is 300, and it's not enough for the mouth. That's why let's select the snot, then go to user data and manage user data. Then find max value and increase it to something bigger, like 1000. Now it can be much longer. I want to add a bit more functionality. If I switch to object mode and scale the entire snot, all the radii changes simultaneously. We can also change the scales of the spheres independently, but the radius of this knot stays the same. And I want to link the radius of this knot to the radius of the sphere. To do so, double-click on Espresso tag, and let's remember how everything works here. The thickness of this knot depends on this node, and it is basically the radius of this circle. And this radius controlled by the distance between two nulls, start and end. It also remapped by range mapper. When the distance is 0, the radius is 13. And when the distance is max distance, the radius is 0. So we need to tweak this parameter to change the maximum radius. So let's add this output lower parameter as an input. Click on a blue box and find it in a list. I want it to depend on the radius of the start sphere, so let's drop it into Espresso and use its radius as an output, and connect it to output lower. Now the snot radius is the same as the radius of this sphere. And we can add one more interesting detail. Note that in sweep object we have this parameter end scale. It changes from 0 to 100% and depends on the radius of the circle, which means this sphere. And we can use the second sphere to define the end radius using the ratio between two spheres to control this end scale parameter. So let's go to Espresso, drag and drop sweep object, and use end scale parameter as an input. We're going to use the end sphere radius, so let's drop the end sphere and use the radius as an output. And to get the right ratio, we need to divide the end radius by the start radius. For this, we will use node called math. In Node tab, switch function to divide, then connect the end radius to the first input and divide it by the start radius, and pass the result to the end scale. Now, if they have the same radius, we will get 100%. If the end smaller, we got less, and vice versa. Now we can move them and scale independently. Reset all the parameters and copy the entire setup into the project. I'll leave parent null in the center of the coordinates and will move only start and end nulls. Now select the frame where the mouth open and adjust the positions and scale of the start and end nulls. Also create a null where you can store all the duplicates. I'll call it snots and place the snot inside. Let's bind this knot to JAWS. Select start null and create constraint tag. Switch to parent mode, and as a target we're going to use null called top. Then do the same for the end null. Create constraint tag, switch to parent, and then use bot null as a target. Now let's see how it works. I also want to check simulation. And now we can adjust all the parameters. By the way, if you want to select nulls in viewport, you can simplify it a bit. Go to Select menu, Selection filter, and hit None. Now you cannot select anything in viewport, and if you filter only nulls, you will be able to select only nulls but no other objects. It will be very convenient if you want to adjust one particular snot parameters. For instance, you can select the middle null in viewport, then hover over the object manager and hit S. It will reveal the selected object in hierarchy. And now you can select the track modifier and adjust its parameters. Now we can safely duplicate snots in Object Manager, and nulls start and end will be constrained to top and bot. So let's try to duplicate it and then rearrange nulls start and end. Make sure it works. You can also scale it and simulation should also work. To make them all hang out in different ways, you can adjust track modifiers independently for each snot. As we did with Marshmallow, we're going to use Volume Builder and Volume Mesher. Just make it a parent of snots and adjust some settings. I'll set voxel size to 6 and maybe use SDF Smooth. Next, I'm going to duplicate them, rearrange start and end nulls, maybe scale it a bit, and change some parameters. Sometimes I'm gonna tweak track modifier parameters to make them look different. I also want to create two thick snots closer to the sides and call them L and R. It will help me to find them easier in Object Manager. I got this result, and we can add more details. If I select this right thick snot, the null start contains the sphere, and we can duplicate it inside the null. I will immediately rename it so as not to be confused with the start sphere, because it affects some parameters. And now I can move it around inside the null to create some kind of bubbles. Same way, I can duplicate it and place inside the end null. And it will be constrained to the bottom part. This way you can also bind objects to the middle null. I'll speed up the video and duplicate it a few times and do the same for the left side. On reference, we got marshmallow eyes inside the mouth. That's why I made this simple model. I'll paste it into the project and arrange it as in reference. Next, I need to bind it somewhere, so I'm going to create a constraint tag, switch it to parent, and let's constrain it to the end null of this thick left snot. We got some priority issues as always. Let's fix it. Select constraint tag and set some very high priority. Since we use parent constraint, we can still adjust position. I'll duplicate it and rename properly. And this time I'm gonna constrain it to the middle null of this right thick snot. And I'll adjust the overall composition a little more. And I got something like this. Next, we're going to propagate the scales over the skin. But before that, I want to create UV coordinates. And for convenience, let's create standard material and apply it to scale. We're going to use it for preview, so select the material and as a texture use gradient and switch type to circular. I want this gradient to spread from the root to the edges of the scale. To do so, select material tag and switch projection to flat. Then use texture mode to adjust it a little. I want to leave it in the center of the root and scale it like this. You should achieve this kind of result. I want to adjust it a little. To do so, select the material tag and hit Generate UV Coordinates. UV tag should appear here. Now switch Layout to UV Edit. Select the geometry and switch to Point Mode. Now we can use transformation tools to adjust UVs. I just want to scale these points like this. And you can see how gradient changes in viewport. I also want to check how the vertical gradient looks like, which goes lengthwise. I want to use it to make the root transparent. Now we can remove material and material tag. Just leave the UV tag. There is a lot of ways to bind the objects to a surface. Let me show you some of them. Select the scale, hold down Alt and create cloner. In Cloner Attributes in Object tab, set Mode to Object. We're going to propagate it over the skin, so select the skin geometry. You can fix the orientation of the clones. Just go to Transform tab and adjust rotation. In Object tab, you can change the number of clones and adjust the seed. Also, you can experiment with distribution types. I'm going to use Surface. Now they distributed evenly along all polygons, and you can restrict it to some polygon selection. Just select your surface, switch to polygon mode, and select polygons you want to use. Then go to Select menu and hit Store Selection. You can see Selection tag appeared, which stores your selected polygons. Now go to Cloner Attribute and drop Selection tag into this field. And now Cloner uses only selected polygons. With cloners, you can use effectors. So let's create some effector, for example, random effector. Make sure it's in effectors list of the cloner. In Parameters tab, I'll disable position and I want to randomize scale and a little rotation. This works the same as spheres in Marshmallow lesson. You can change the seed and you can also use vertex maps. We already have vertex map, so let's try to use it. For this, I'll use plane effector. I want scales to become smaller when they come closer to the lips. In Parameter tab, I'll disable position and decrease absolute scale. Don't forget to add it into effectors list of the cloner, and to use vertex map, we just need to add it into fields list of our plane effector. You can see something happening, and we can exaggerate this effect if we remap the vertex map. Just enable remapping, and I'll switch to curve mode and adjust the graph. This effect will be more noticeable with bigger amount of clones. This way you can experiment with effectors and vertex maps to achieve interesting results. In this case, we are lucky with the normals of the polygons and all the scales oriented the way we need. But if you want more precise control, I'll show you another way. Let me just disable cloner and effectors and duplicate the scale model. Now select the scale model, hold down Alt and create a null. I'll call it also scale. Now select the null you created and create the constraint tag. This time we will use clamp mode. We will clamp this object to surface. We will use mode fix axis, also enable use normals. I'll leave the axis like this for now, and here select normal. As a target, we're going to use the surface we want to stick it to, so just drag and drop the skin object. This mode allows us to constrain the null to the surface. It still doesn't work because we also need to set distance to 0. Now if you try to move this null, it will always slide on the surface. It also rotates only perpendicular to the surface. And if you need to adjust the orientation of the scale, you need to rotate the object inside the null. Let's make this null visible in viewport. We need to be able to select it in viewport to adjust its position. And I also want to give it some bright color. Now we can move it, rotate and scale, and it will always be on the surface. Let's create a null for all our scales and call it scales. And we can start duplicate scales in the viewport. Just remember, you need to duplicate nulls, not geometry. I'll select some frame where the mouth is shut and continue duplicate. Now they are not bound to the surface, they just slide on it. And to stick them to the surface, we need to select all the tags and click Lock Position. In this mode, we cannot adjust their locations, but now they move along with the surface. And we got another priority issue. This time set priority type to generators. Everything works perfect. And with this setup, we can also use effectors. For instance, we can create plane effector, just place it inside scales, set deformation type to object, and now we can rotate it in local coordinates. You can use this method using clamp constraints and propagate them manually, or you can use cloner. But also you can mix these two methods. That's why I'll remove everything except one scale with clamp constraint, and I also want to add some user data which will allow me to lock positions of all scales at the same time. To do so, select Scales Null and create a user data. We'll use type boolean because we need checkbox and call it lock position. I want this user data checkbox control this lock position parameter. But not only this, but also all constraint tags of all duplicates we will make. That's why select scale itself and create Expresso tag on it. Next, drop constraint tag into Expresso editor and use lock position as input, and it will be controlled by scales user data. Let's check how everything works. Now the position is unlocked. I'll duplicate the scale a few times and it unlocked everywhere. Let's try to lock it using user data, and it's locked. And now, instead of duplicating them manually, we can use cloner. I'll use the same cloner I used before. I'll just remove the old geometry and replace it with scale with constraint tag. And it's very important to unlock position at this stage. After that, we can adjust cloner parameters, experiment with different fields and vertex maps. When you are happy with the arrangement, select the cloner and make it editable. You can also remove effectors, and now we got a null with a lot of duplicates, and each duplicate already bound to the surface using clamp constraint. Now you can lock position of all constraint tags. In this mode they stick to the surface, but we cannot move them around, so if you want to adjust the arrangement, you need to unlock position. Let's do it. Now you can move them, scale and rotate along the surface. If you want, you can also delete some scales or duplicate. By the way, I forgot to place them into scales now. Let's do this, and we can remove this cloner now. When you're done with arrangement, just lock the position and see how it looks with animation. I also want to use plane effector just to make them stick out a little. Don't forget to switch deformation to object. Now let's prepare it to render. At first, create a null and put everything in it except camera. It will be very simple, so I'll speed up the video and will comment a little. At first, I always create some simple lighting. In this case, it's just a disk area light, and immediately run Redshift Render View. It is convenient to create some standard Redshift material and at first apply it to all objects. It will help to adjust the light intensity. I also make the color a little bluish just to make it look closer to the reference in general. I want to subdivide the geometry, but instead of subdivision surface, I'm going to use Redshift Object tag. In Geometry tab, click Override, Enable, and set max subdivisions to 2. When the basic lighting is done, I will just duplicate this material, adjust it a little, and use it for other objects. First, I'll create material for teeth. I'll just change color. I want to make it a little yellowish. Teeth are the most bright part in the image, so now we can adjust the light a little bit more so that they are not overexposed. I'll duplicate this material once again and reuse it for gums. Nothing special here, just make it pink and maybe decrease roughness to make it glossier. Another material for the lips. It will stay the same in general, maybe less saturated. For the bubble gum, I will use the same material we used for the marshmallow. I will just duplicate it from the marshmallow project and then apply it to volume measure. If you remember, we blended two materials, white and pink. I'll remove everything except pink material and connect it to output. I also adjust its color a bit. And for the bubbles between teeth, I'll reuse the same material. Because we use volume measure, we have no UVs, so I'm gonna use flat mapping the same way we use it in Marshmallow. Just select the material tag, set projection to flat, and use texture mode to adjust the projection. When the most of the materials are ready, we can work out the lighting. For instance, I can duplicate it and illuminate from the right side, and I'll maybe drop down the intensity a bit and make it a little bluish. And to make it more dramatic, I'll create the bottom light to imitate the fireplace. and give it some orange color. Now let's create a material for the scales. I'll just duplicate this blue material and apply it to scales now. Here I want to use gradient, so hit C and find ramp. At first, I'll connect it directly to output to see it in render view. I'll change type to circular and make sure UV mapping works fine. And now we can start to adjust the colors. I just want to make edges lighter and colder and make it bluish violet in the middle. On this stage, I can connect it to color and connect material to output, and then adjust the final look. I'll create another gradient and I will use it to make the roots of the scales transparent. That's why I will connect it to opacity. And then adjust the gradient to make smooth transition from the root. This creates the illusion that the scales are growing directly from the skin. I also want to create some shiny dots and flakes over the skin, but at first we need to adjust the UV coordinates. I have some UV tag here, but I'll remove it and let's create it from scratch. Disable surface. I will reuse the first material I created, so I will just drag this material tag onto skin object. Then set projection to flat, and then use texture mode to adjust the projection. I'll just scale it up so that it fits the dimensions of the object. And now we can generate UVW coordinates. After that, don't forget to enable surface and we can proceed with material. It's just standard material for now. And to make flakes, I will use Maxon Noise and switch type to Voronoi 1. I'll connect it to output to see it clear. I just want to make sure that the UV coordinates moves with the skin. Next, I'll tweak noise parameters, in particular low and high clip, to create these kind of dots. I'm going to use this noise as a mask to blend two materials. For this, I'll create Material Blender node, connect it to output, and I'll duplicate this material and connect one to color and the other to material color, and use noise as blend color. I'll change the color of one of the materials to understand which is responsible for the dots. In my case, it is the first material. I want these dots to be shinier than the skin, so I'll set index of refraction to 2.5 and adjust the roughness a bit. I also want to add some bumps to the dots material. For this, I'm going to use another Maxon Noise and a bump map node, and connect it to bump input. I'll scale up the noise. I want to create an effect when each scale is slightly rotated relative to the skin. And I maybe increase the bump height. Now if we connect everything with Material Blender, the flakes will look slightly different from the skin and from each other. I'll tweak everything a little more. For instance, the scale of the bump, the height, and maybe index of refraction. And it remains only to make a gold tooth. I'll just duplicate the teeth material, then select the teeth geometry, select polygons in polygon mode, and drop the material. Give it some yellow color, and to make it look like gold, increase metalness. Now let's proceed to render. I will use the same render settings I used in Marshmallow lesson. In Output tab, don't forget to set 12 FPS. I will render it from 0 to 13 because 14 is the same as 0. Choose the format and the folder you want to save the images, and then click Render to Picture Viewer. And this is my result.